What if the greatest victory in history was achieved not by strength, but by deception? Imagine a city whose walls are considered impregnable, a city that has withstood every attack for 10 years. Thousands of warriors have lost their lives, countless battles have been fought, and yet the war seems to have no end. But then a single idea arises, a ruse that will change everything. Before we dive into this legendary story, I have a question for you. Would you have dragged the mysterious wooden horse into the city, or would you have destroyed it? Write your decision now in the comments and think carefully, because it was precisely this decision that once determined the fate of an entire city. If you are fascinated by such epic stories, then show it with a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any more exciting stories. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a myth. It is a story about trust, deception, and the downfall of one of the greatest cities of antiquity. Chapter 1: The Prophecy. Even before the first sword was drawn, even before the sails of the Greek fleet darkened the horizon, a shadow lay over Troy. It was not a visible enemy, not an army of flesh and blood, but something much older, a premonition, a whisper of fate that ran quietly through the halls of the palace. The city itself seemed unshakable. Its walls rose high into the sky, built of huge blocks of stone, which were said to have been set by the gods themselves. Merchants called out their wares, children played in the streets, and the temples were filled with the scent of burnt offerings. For most residents, Troy was not just a city, it was a fortress, a promise of security in an uncertain world. But deep inside the royal palace, the mood was different. King Priam stood at the window of his chamber and looked out at the city he ruled. His eyes were tired, though the day was still young. Next to him burned a single oil lamp, its flickering light making the shadows dance on the walls. It was not the first time that he had remained in this attitude, between pride and worry, between hope and a fear that he could hardly put into words. Because he remembered. Many years earlier, long before the war was even a thought, there had been a dream. His wife had had it, a dream so clear and terrifying that it had been indelibly etched in her memory. She had dreamed of a fire that came from her own body, a fire that spread, grew, and finally swallowed up all of Troy. The priests had been called. Men who interpreted the signs of the gods, who heard voices where others only heard wind. And her answer had been clear. This child, they had said, will bring ruin to Troy. It had been a moment that changed everything. A newborn baby, innocent, helpless, little more than a breath, suddenly became a threat to an entire city. And yet the word of the gods was law. Those who ignored it were playing with doom. Priam had hesitated. Of course he did. How could a father act differently? The child was his son, his flesh and blood. But the fear of the prophecy had been stronger than any feeling. After all, he had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The child was to be taken away. Not killed, at least not directly. Instead, it was given to a servant with the order to take it to the mountains and leave it to its fate. A cruel solution, born of desperation. It was persuaded that the gods would decide whether the child should live or die. And so the infant was carried away, out of the safe walls of Troy, up into the barren wild heights where few people lived. The years passed. Troy flourished. The markets became larger, the trade routes richer, and the name of the city became known far beyond the borders. The prophecy slowly fell into oblivion, or at least became something that was preferred not to be said out loud. But fate has a strange way of fulfilling itself. Far away from the walls of Troy, a young man grew up. He did not know his origins, knew nothing about kings or prophecies. For him, life was simple, shaped by nature, hard work, and a certain freedom that you would never find within palace walls. He was strong, faster than most, and had a charisma that attracted others without him noticing. The people around him liked him, trusted him. It was as if there was something in him that was bigger than himself. One day, however, everything was to change. It started with a party. A great event was being prepared in Troy, games, competitions, an event that attracted people from all directions. The young man from the mountains also heard about it. Curiosity drove him, perhaps something else, something deeper that he himself did not understand. When he entered the city, it was as if he was really seeing for the first time. The high walls, the busy streets, the voices, the smells, everything was overwhelming. And yet it felt strangely familiar, as if he had been here before. The games began. Competitors competed against each other, in strength, skill, and courage. At first, the young man only observed, but soon he himself became part of it. And what happened next made many sit up and take notice. He won. Not just once, but again and again. Against experienced fighters, against men who had trained all their lives. It was as if every victory came effortlessly to him. The spectators cheered, but the palace took notice. Priam had the young man brought to him. When they faced each other, there was silence between them for a moment. The king looked at the stranger, looked into his face, into his eyes, and something stirred in him. A memory, a feeling that he couldn't grasp immediately. "Who are you?" he finally asked. The young man answered honestly. He knew no name that mattered, no origin that made him special. He was just himself. And yet that was not enough. There were signs. Small details that came together to form a picture. A scar, a piece of jewelry that had once been given to him, things that suddenly created a connection between the past and the present. The truth came out. The young man was no stranger. He was the prodigal son. The moment hit Priam like a blow. All these years, all the decisions, and now the result was right in front of him. The child he had wanted to sacrifice was alive. And not only that, it had returned. The prophecy had not disappeared. She had only waited. But instead of feeling fear, something unexpected happened. Joy. Priam took in his son, acknowledged him, and gave him back his place. The past has not been forgotten, but it has been rewritten. Perhaps, the king hoped, the signs had been misinterpreted. Perhaps fate could be changed after all. The city celebrated. The lost prince had returned. His name was pronounced again, his origin recognized. For the people, it was a story of loss and return, of hope and family. But not everyone shared this view. There were those who remembered, who had not forgotten the words of the priests. They knew that prophecies don't just disappear. And somewhere, deep inside the city, that soft whisper stirred again. A feeling that something was wrong. That the story that had just begun would not end well. For fate had made its first move. And Troy had welcomed him. Chapter 2: The Rape of Helena. The return of the lost prince had plunged Troy into a state of euphoria. People celebrated as if the gods themselves had given them a gift. Music filled the streets, wine flowed in streams, and the name of the young man was carried from mouth to mouth. Paris, the son of the king who had escaped fate. But while the city rejoiced, the gods watched. High up, beyond the view of the people, they argued, as so often, about power, honor, and influence. For them, mortals were no more than pawns on a playing field, important, but interchangeable. And sometimes, when boredom or pride drove them to do so, they intervened directly in people's lives. So it all began with an argument. It was no ordinary dispute, but one that was important even by divine standards. 3 goddesses, each powerful, each proud, claimed the same title, the most beautiful among them. In order to resolve the conflict, a decision was demanded. A verdict that was to be final. And for that you needed a judge. Not a god, because none of them was impartial, but a mortal. Someone who wasn't part of their eternal rivalries. The choice fell on Paris. Why him? Maybe it was a coincidence. But perhaps also the quiet work of fate, which led him exactly where he was needed. Paris didn't know what he was getting into when the goddesses appeared before him. For him, it was a moment between awe and confusion. How should a man judge beings whose beauty and power were far beyond anything he knew? But he was not spared the decision. One after the other stepped in front of him. The first promised him power, dominion over countries, fame that would make him immortal. The second offered him wisdom and success in war, the ability to defeat any opponent, to win any battle. And then came the third. She did not appear with promises of power or fame. Her voice was lower, almost soft, and yet there was a conviction in her that was hard to ignore. She promised him love. Not just any love, but the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris hesitated. The first two offers were tempting. Power and victory were things that many aspired to, but they felt abstract. The idea of love, on the other hand, was immediate, tangible, human. And so he made his decision. He chose the third goddess. A moment that lasted little longer than a breath, and yet it was to change the world. The other goddesses did not accept the decision in silence. There was anger in her eyes, a coldness in her words that would haunt Paris for a long time to come. He hadn't just chosen, he had created two powerful enemies. But at that time he didn't know that yet. For him, it was the beginning of a promise. The most beautiful woman in the world. Her name was Helena. She lived far away from Troy, in a land marked by wealth and power. She was known not only for her beauty, but also for her position. Her hand was not a gift that could be easily accepted. She was already married. With a king. But that didn't matter to Paris. Or maybe he didn't want to admit it. The words of the goddess reverberated in him, leaving no room for doubt. The journey began. Paris left Troy, accompanied by a few confidants. The sea lay calm before them, as if it were paving the way itself. Days passed as the ship glided through the waves, carried by wind and hope. When they reached their destination, everything seemed peaceful. The city in which Helena lived was magnificent, its walls strong, its people proud. Paris was received as befits a prince, as a guest, not as an enemy. Hospitality was a sacred law, one that was respected even in times of mistrust. And so he entered the palace. There he saw her for the first time. Helena. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Everything that had previously seemed important to him receded into the background. The sounds, the voices, even his own thoughts, everything became unimportant. Only she remained. It was more than just beauty. There was something in her presence, in the way she moved, the way she spoke. Something that was difficult to describe and yet impossible to overlook. And maybe, perhaps this was already the influence of the gods. Because Helena also felt something. A look, a moment, and suddenly there was a connection that had not existed before. Whether they were real feelings or just the work of divine powers could not be said. But it was enough. The days passed, and conversations turned into encounters. Encounters became closeness. Paris told of Troy, of his return, of the city that had taken him in. Helena listened, asked questions, and there was an expression in her eyes that betrayed more than her words said. But time worked against them. Because Helena was not free. Her husband was not just a man, but a king. A ruler with power, with allies, with pride. What happened here was more than just a secret romance. It was a betrayal. And betrayal rarely goes unpunished. Paris knew that. And yet he made a decision. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was pride. But maybe it's just the inevitable drawing of fate. He took Helena with him. Whether she left voluntarily or not, many would argue about that later. Some said she followed out of love. Others claimed that she had been seduced or even kidnapped. The truth was probably somewhere in between. But one thing was certain. When the ship reached Troy again, nothing was the same as before. The return was not accompanied by jubilation. There were no parties, no music, no exuberant joy. Instead, a tense silence lay over the city. People looked at the woman who had come with Paris, and even those who didn't know the background sensed that something was wrong. In the palace, the situation quickly became clear. Priam listened to the story, of the gods, of the decision of Helena. And while Paris was speaking, the king became aware of the consequences of this act. This was no ordinary conflict. This was an affront. An insult that could not go unanswered. Because Helena was not just a woman. She was a symbol. And their loss would not simply be accepted. The news spread quickly across the sea. From city to city, from king to king. And with each passing on, the outrage grew. An alliance was formed. Not only out of duty, but out of pride, out of revenge, out of the desire to repay an injustice. The signs were pointing to war. In Troy, people began to prepare. The walls were strengthened, supplies increased, warriors gathered. What had previously been only a distant possibility now became an inescapable reality. And in the middle of all this stood Paris. The man who had once returned as a prodigal son now became the trigger of a conflict that went far beyond him. The prophecy that had been ignored for so long began to be fulfilled. Not suddenly, not with a loud bang, but slowly, step by step. Like a fire that initially only glows, before it devours everything. Chapter 3: The Assembled Greeks. The news spread like wildfire across the sea. What seemed like a personal conflict in Troy became a question of honor, power, and order in the lands of the Greeks. It wasn't just the kidnapping or disappearance of a woman. It was a violation of a sacred law. Hospitality. A principle that had endured for generations. Those who were accepted as guests were under the protection of their host. Breaking this bond meant more than just betrayal. It was an insult to the gods themselves. And that is exactly what Paris had done. In the palace of Sparta, there was a silence that lay heavy on the walls. Servants moved cautiously, as if even their steps could increase the anger that was gathering inside the king. Menelaus stood in the great hall, his hands clenched into fists. Before him lay the last traces of what had happened, an empty place where Helena had once been, and the memory of a guest who had betrayed his trust. His gaze was hard. Not only out of pain, but out of humiliation. Because what had happened had not remained hidden. Other rulers already knew about it. And in her world, weakness meant more than personal loss. It could shake an entire empire. Menelaus knew he had to act. But he was not alone. His brother, Agamemnon, was more powerful, a man of greater influence, with an eye for the big picture. While Menelaus was driven by emotions, Agamemnon thought in strategies, in possibilities, in consequences. When the two faced each other, it quickly became clear that this would not be an easy campaign of revenge. "This is not just your war," Agamemnon said calmly as he walked around the room. "This affects us all." Menelaus did not answer immediately. He knew that his brother was right, and that made the situation all the more difficult. Because such a conflict would not only cost blood. It would devour time, tie up resources, perhaps weaken entire cities. But the alternative was worse. Inaction. And in the eyes of the other rulers, inaction meant weakness. So the decision was made. The Greeks would gather. Messengers were sent, ships prepared, news delivered. Every king, every prince who had once sworn to protect Helena was now reminded of this oath. Because there was an oath. Long before Helena had been married, numerous men had asked for her hand in marriage. To avoid conflict, an agreement had been made. No matter who would marry her, everyone else would respect this alliance and support the husband in case of danger. At the time, it had seemed like a precautionary measure. Now it has become an obligation. One by one, the rulers answered. Some out of duty, others out of ambition, others because they saw the conflict as an opportunity. Because war was not only destruction, it was also an opportunity. For fame, for booty, for power. Among them were big names. Men whose stories have already been told before they even set sail. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his time, young, fast, and almost invincible. His reputation preceded him, and his participation alone gave weight to the campaign. But Achilles was not easy to win. He knew his fate. That a war against Troy would bring him immortal glory, but also an early end. And so he hesitated. It took conviction, cunning, and perhaps a little pressure to finally persuade him to leave. Then there was Odysseus. A man who did not stand out for his raw strength, but for his intellect. He was not a friend of unnecessary wars, not a man who blindly went into battle. When he heard the call, he first tried to escape. He pretended to be insane, did things that didn't make sense, hoping not to be engaged. But even he could not escape the oath. And so he became part of the coming army. Other kings joined in. Each brought their own warriors, their own ships, their own ambitions. Some saw themselves as heroes, others as strategists, others as simple fighters who were just looking for their place. But they all had one thing in common. They were on their way to Troy. The meeting point was the coast. Where the land merged into the sea, a fleet began to form, the likes of which the world had never seen before. Ships lined up one after the other, their sails stretched in the wind, their hulls ready for the journey. The sea itself seemed to sense that something big was about to happen. The air was filled with sounds, the shouting of orders, the clinking of weapons, the creaking of wood. Men moved between the ships, checked equipment, said goodbye to families. Because many of them knew. Not everyone would return. Agamemnon stood on the edge of the coast and looked at the growing army. There was satisfaction in his gaze, but also responsibility. This was his army, his campaign, and its risk. Because such an alliance was fragile. Every king was used to ruling himself. Everyone had their own pride, their own ideas. Uniting them was a challenge. Keeping them together would be even more difficult. But for the time being, it worked. They were united by a common goal. Troy. While the preparations continued, there were moments of silence. Moments when individual warriors paused and looked out to sea. Thoughts of what lay ahead of them mixed with memories of what they left behind. Some sought fame. Others feared the unknown. But no one could retreat anymore. The first gust of wind that filled the sails was like a signal. The journey began. Ship after ship set off, glided over the waves, moved away from the coast. The land became smaller until it was finally only a shadow on the horizon. In front of them lay Troy, a city that many of them had never seen, and yet it had already become the center of their destiny. The days at sea were long. Sometimes calm, sometimes marked by storms. The men got used to the rhythm of the waves, to life between sky and water. Conversations ensued, stories were told, alliances were forged. But again and again one thought returned. What would she expect? Troy was not just any goal. It was a city with strong walls, with experienced warriors, with a history that stretched back a long way. And they had no guarantee of success. When the fleet finally reached land, the moment had come. The ships were pulled to the beach. The first steps were taken on foreign soil. The men looked at the plain in front of them, and in the distance, barely visible, rose the city that had triggered all this. Troy. Everything was still quiet. No battle, no noise, no chaos. Just a moment between the beginning and the end. But everyone knew. This peace would not last long. Because two worlds were now facing each other. And none of them was willing to give in. Chapter 4. The Walls of Troy. Even from a distance, the walls of Troy looked like something that had not been created for humans. They rose from the plain, vast and motionless, as if they had always stood there and would still exist long after everything else was gone. The Greeks approaching the city saw it for the first time in all its grandeur, and even the bravest among them felt a moment of doubt. These walls were not just stone. They were a promise. A promise of security, of permanence, of invincibility. In Troy itself, the arrival of the fleet had long been noticed. From the towers, the guardians had seen the dark dots on the horizon, which slowly grew larger until they turned out to be ships, lots of ships. Too many to ignore. The news spread quickly. What had previously been only a looming possibility now became reality. The war, which had been announced by words and rumors, was now right at the gates of the city. But panic did not break out. Not immediately. Because Troy was prepared. King Priam had recognized the signs. Even before the first ships had been sighted, he had begun to take action. Supplies were collected, wells checked, weapons sharpened. The city had not relied on peace, it had prepared for war. And at the center of this preparation was a man. Hector. The firstborn of Priam, the protector of the city, a warrior who fought not for glory, but for his homeland. While other heroes dreamed of legends and honor, Hector thought of the people behind the walls, the families, the children, everything that could be lost. He stood on one of the towers and looked out at the army of Greeks that was forming on the beach. His posture was calm, but his eyes were alert. "They have come," he said quietly. Next to him stood other warriors, experienced men who knew what was coming. They saw the same scene, but each of them interpreted it differently. Some saw a challenge, others an inevitable end. Hector, however, saw a task. "The walls will hold," he continued, more to himself than to the others, "as long as we last." Because he knew that stone alone was not enough. A wall is only as strong as the people who defend it. And Troy had many such people. The city began to change. Where traders had previously spread out their goods, weapons were now distributed. Where children had played, there was suddenly order, discipline, preparation. Women and men worked side by side to secure what was theirs. The gates were reinforced, guards doubled, signals fixed. Everyone knew where their place was, what was expected of them. And yet, there was a quiet tension underneath all this. Because despite all the preparation, no one knew how this war would go. The atmosphere in the palace was tense. Priam sat on his throne, but his thoughts were far away. Before him stood his sons, Hector, calm and resolute, and Paris, whose look was difficult to interpret. It was a moment in which much remained unspoken. But finally Priam broke the silence. "That's the price," he said slowly, "for a decision." His gaze wandered to Paris. It was not an accusation, at least not openly. But the meaning of his words was clear. Paris withstood the gaze. "I don't regret it," he answered. His voice was firm, perhaps firmer than it should have been. Because deep down he knew that the situation could no longer be reversed. What had happened could not be undone. And now he had to stand by it. Hector watched the two. He said nothing, but inside two sides were fighting each other. On the one hand, Paris was his brother. On the other hand, he was the trigger for everything that was about to happen. But Hector made his decision. Not for Paris, but for Troy. "It doesn't matter how it started anymore," he finally said. "Only how it ends." His words lay like a weight in the room. Because they were true. Outside, in front of the walls, the Greeks began to pitch their camp. Tents were erected, weapons sorted, orders distributed. They too worked with precision, with a goal in mind. It was not a chaotic army. It was an army. And she had come to stay. The first days passed without direct confrontation. Both sides watched each other, cautiously approaching. It was a silent trial of strength, a game of patience and strategy. The Greeks tested the defenses, approached the walls without daring a full attack. Arrows were shot, small battles were fought, but nothing decisive happened. Troy held out. The walls turned out to be what they had been hoped to be, an obstacle that was not easy to overcome. Every attack was repelled. Every attempt to get closer cost the Greeks time and men. Hector led the defense with a clear head. He knew when to intervene, when to retreat. He understood that a hasty failure could be just as dangerous as inaction. And so Troy remained untouched for the time being. But the war had only just begun. With each night that passed, it became clearer that this was not going to be a quick conflict. The Greeks were too many, too determined to simply give up. And Troy was too strong, too well prepared, to fall easily. It was a balance. A dangerous balance. In the city, people began to get used to the new reality. The war became part of everyday life. The sounds of battle, the shouts of the guards, the clash of weapons, all of this became familiar. And yet the fear remained. Not loud, not visible, but always present. Especially in the moments of rest. When the sun went down and the walls were bathed in dim light, when the sounds of the day ceased and only the distant murmur of the enemy camp could be heard. Then everyone asked themselves the same question. How long? How long could they hold out? Hector often walked through the city alone. He saw the people, talked to them, listened. For him, the war was not just a series of battles, it was what happened between them. The hope, the fear, the will to continue. One evening he stopped and looked up at the walls that stood out against the sky. They were strong, but not indestructible. And that was the truth, which he didn't say out loud to anyone. Because even the strongest walls can fall. Not necessarily through violence, but through time, or through mistakes, or by something that comes from within. But it wasn't that far yet. Troy was still standing. The walls were still holding. The outcome was still open. But deep in the silence, beyond stone and steel, something began to move. Something that no wall could stop. Fate. And it had long since set its sights on Troy. Chapter 5: Heroes and Gods. The war outside the walls of Troy was more than just a clash of people, weapons, and strategies. It was a game that was fought on two levels at once. While men were fighting, bleeding, and dying on the earth below, the gods looked down from above, watched every movement, every decision, and intervened whenever they pleased. For mortals, war was a matter of honor and survival, but for the gods, it was as much an entertainment as it was an expression of their own rivalries. They did not stand united on one side, but distributed their favor according to their own interests, sympathy, pride, or wounded vanity. And so every battle was decided not only by the strength of the warriors, but also by the invisible hand that worked behind them. Some days seemed to miraculously pass in favor of Troy, as if their fighters were unshakable and their ranks untouchable, while on other days the Greeks rushed forward with a force that was hard to explain, as if they themselves had the gods at their side. And often that was exactly the case. Among the Greeks, one name stood out in particular: Achilles, the son of a goddess and a mortal, a warrior whose fame was already sweeping across the battlefield before him. When he appeared, the atmosphere changed. Even the most experienced fighters stopped when they saw him, because Achilles didn't fight like an ordinary man. His movements were faster, his blows more precise, and his presence alone could strengthen the courage of his allies or break that of his opponents. But with its strength came its pride, a pride that was as dangerous as any weapon. Achilles fought not only for Greece, not only for fame, but also for himself, for the recognition he felt he deserved. And it was precisely this pride that would soon lead to tensions that would change the course of the war. But Achilles was not the only hero whose actions carried weight. On the other side of the wall stood Hector, the defender of Troy, a man who fought not for glory, but for his family, for his city, for everything that lay behind the walls. While Achilles fought for his own legend, Hector fought for the survival of others, and that is exactly what made him a different, perhaps even greater hero. People trusted him, not because he was invincible, but because he stayed, because he took responsibility even when the danger grew. When he went into battle, the men followed him not out of fear or duty, but out of conviction. There was more than just enmity between these two men. It was a contrast that reflected the entire war: glory against duty, pride against responsibility, attack against defense. But even they were not free in their decisions, because above them stood the gods, who pursued their own plans. Some of them supported the Greeks, not out of justice, but out of personal resentment, out of offended vanity, or out of a desire to demonstrate their power. Others sided with Troy because they valued the city or because they opposed the interference of their rivals. Thus, every battle became a game of visible and invisible forces, and often people could not distinguish whether a victory was the result of their own courage or the result of divine intervention. There were moments when a warrior suddenly showed a strength he had never possessed before, as if an alien force were working through him, and others when even the best fighters failed, as if they had been deprived of support at the crucial moment. The gods were capricious, unpredictable, and their interventions did not follow any logic that was understandable to humans. For them, the war was not final, not irreversible. They could intervene, direct, change, while mortals had to bear the consequences. And so the people of Troy and the camp of the Greeks lived in a world where nothing was certain, not even their own abilities. A victory could turn into a defeat, a moment of triumph could turn into a loss in the next moment, and often no one knew why. Especially at night, when the battlefield became quiet and only the crackling of the fires could be heard, many thought about it. They looked at the sky, looked for signs, for answers, for something that could give them security. But the gods rarely answered clearly. They spoke through events, through coincidences, through phrases that only made sense in retrospect, if at all. In those moments, the war became something bigger, something that went beyond the people. It was not just a battle for Troy, not just a conflict between two sides, but part of a larger fabric, a game whose rules no one fully understood. And yet people had to insist on it. They couldn't get out, couldn't escape, even if they wanted to. Every step, every decision led them deeper into it, making them a part of the story that unfolded before them. For Achilles, this meant that his path was inevitable, that the fame he sought was inextricably linked to his fate. For Hector, it meant that his duty always led him back to the battlefield, no matter how great the danger. And for the gods, it meant that their game continued, that they continued to exert influence, continued to decide who fell and who stood. So the days passed, the fighting intensified, the losses greater, and slowly it began to become apparent that this war would not be decided by strength alone. It took more than courage, more than weapons, more than numbers. It needed something that was beyond all that. And while humans still believed that they were in control, of victory and defeat, the gods had long since begun to plan the next moves, invisibly, unstoppably, and with a patience that only immortals possess. Chapter 6: 10 Years of War. The first battles outside the walls of Troy still had something of movement, of dynamism, of the hope of a quick decision. Attacks were planned, defenses tested, individual victories celebrated, as if they could already determine the outcome of the war. But over time, everything changed. Days became months, months became years, and finally the war had become no longer an event, but a state of affairs. Something that did not begin and did not end, but was simply there, like the change of day and night, like the coming and going of the seasons. The men who had once come to the shore full of energy and expectation had changed. Their faces had become harder, their movements more routine, their hopes quieter. The war had taken away their illusion that everything could be decided quickly. Instead, he had forced patience on them, a patience that didn't come from rest, but from exhaustion. The Greeks had expanded their camp into a permanent structure. What had once been just a collection of tents became a small, functioning community. Paths were created, supply stores were organized, guard systems were perfected. Life in the camp was given its own order, its own logic. Men woke up, trained, fought, ate, slept, and started all over again the next day. For many, this rhythm became the only reality they still knew. Memories of her homeland slowly faded, became something distant, almost unreal. On the other side of the walls, Troy underwent a similar change. There too, life had adapted. The city, which had once been characterized by trade, festivals, and open gates, had turned into a fortress that was constantly on alert. People had learned to live with the threat. They went about their daily tasks, took care of their families, worked, traded, and yet the war was always present, like a shadow that never completely disappeared. The walls offered protection, but they were also a border that restricted life. Every glance outside reminded me that danger was only a few steps away. With each passing year, it became clearer that neither side could gain the upper hand. The Greeks were too strong, too numerous, too determined to simply give up. But Troy was just as steadfast, just as prepared, just as determined not to fall. It was a balance that stabilized itself, a standstill that meant security and despair at the same time. Because while no one lost, no one won either. And that's exactly what became unbearable over time. The struggles themselves also changed. Large battles became rarer, replaced by smaller battles, by raids, by tactical maneuvers aimed at slowly weakening the enemy. It was no longer a war that could be decided by individual decisions, but one that was determined by perseverance. Those who held out longer, those who made fewer mistakes, those who could maintain morale, would win in the end. But it was precisely these factors that were difficult to control. The morale of the men fluctuated. There were days when they were full of energy, when they thought they were on the verge of a breakthrough. And there were days when they could hardly find the strength to raise their weapons, when the thought of another fight seemed unbearable. Especially in the camp of the Greeks, discontent began to spread. Many of them did not expect to be away from home for so long. They had left families behind, fields, obligations. With every year that passed, the question became louder: for what? Was Helena really worth all this? Was this war still justified, or had it long since become something else, a struggle that was only continued out of habit? Tensions also arose among the leaders. Pride and ambition, which had been considered strengths at the beginning, now became problems. Decisions were questioned, orders were discussed, alliances were put to the test. An alliance that consisted of many strong personalities was difficult to hold together, especially when success failed to materialize. But not everything was stable in Troy either. The long duration of the war took its toll. Supplies had to be carefully managed, losses had to be absorbed, hope had to be maintained. People began to feel that even the strongest walls could not provide protection forever. Not necessarily because they would be destroyed, but because the burden grew from within. Fear, doubt, fatigue, all of this could be just as dangerous as an attack from the outside. Hector remained the center of the defense. It was he who kept going out, who led the men, who showed that Troy was still strong. But even he was not untouched by the time. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. Every loss, every fallen warrior, every family grieving, it was all part of his reality. And yet he did not show it openly. For the others, he had to be strong, had to radiate confidence, even if he didn't always feel it himself. Paris, on the other hand, moved in a different space. For him, the war was both a reality and a consequence of his own decision. He fought, he participated, but his relationship to the war was different. For many in the city, he remained an ambivalent figure, the prince who had triggered everything, but did not carry the same burden as Hector. And somewhere between these two stood Priam, the king, the father, the man who watched the development and knew that the prophecy was being fulfilled bit by bit. Not in a single moment, not by a single event, but by the sum of many small changes that together resulted in something unstoppable. The years passed, and with them the perception of the war changed. For the younger men who had joined later, he was nothing special anymore. He was simply part of their lives. They knew nothing else. For the older ones, on the other hand, it was a reminder of how much had been lost. These two perspectives coexisted without fully understanding each other. And that was exactly where another tension lay. The gods continued to observe all this. Sometimes they intervened, sometimes they didn't. But even their influence could not change the basic condition. They could influence individual battles, control individual fates, but the war itself remained. He had developed his own dynamic, his own inertia that was not easy to break. And so everything went on. Day after day, year after year. Without a clear direction, without a visible end. A state of affairs that could not last forever, but long enough to change everyone involved. And it was precisely in this change that the preparation for what was to come lay. Because a war that lasts so long rarely ends by chance. It ends with a turning point. A moment that changes everything. And this moment was closer than many believed. Chapter 7: The Wrath of Achilles. Over the years, the war before Troy had turned into a state of affairs that had become unbearable for many, but it was precisely in this apparent stagnation that new tensions began to develop, which no longer ran only between Greeks and Trojans, but went right through the ranks of the Greeks themselves. It was no longer just the enemy outside the walls that was dangerous, but also the pride, honor, and rivalries within one's own camp. And at the center of these tensions was a man whose name had long since become a symbol, Achilles. His strength was undisputed, his successes had brought him fame that few could match, but it was precisely this fame that had also created expectations that he had of himself and that others placed on him. Achilles wasn't just a warrior, he was the warrior, and he knew it. This certainty was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, for it left no room for doubt, but also no room for humiliation. When the conflict finally broke out, it seemed like a trifle at first, almost like a misunderstanding in the middle of a much larger event, but that was precisely where his danger lay. It was not about strategy, not about the battlefield, but about honor, a concept that weighed more than life or death for the men of the time. Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek army, was a man accustomed to commanding, whose authority was seldom questioned, but he too was proud, perhaps too proud, to realize the significance of what he was doing. When he took from Achilles what he regarded as a token of his honor, he crossed a line that ought not to have been crossed. To outsiders it might seem like a simple property dispute, but for Achilles it was a public humiliation, an attack on his status, on his identity. Something grew inside him that could not be easily calmed. It was not a quick anger that passed just as quickly, but a deep, burning resentment that took hold and influenced every further decision. Achilles withdrew. He refused to fight, refused to be part of an army that did not respect him. This step had far-reaching consequences, because with his retreat, the Greek army lost not only one of its strongest fighters, but also part of its moral strength. The men knew what it meant when Achilles was no longer at their side. It was as if a protective shield was disappearing, as if a certainty they had relied on was shattering. The Trojans quickly noticed this change. On the walls and on the battlefield, it became clear that the balance had shifted. Without Achilles, the Greeks were more vulnerable, less determined, less unstoppable. Hector recognized this opportunity. For him, war had never been a game of pride, but a matter of survival, and every weakness of the opponent was an opportunity he had to take advantage of. Under his leadership, the attacks became more intense, more coordinated, more courageous. The Trojans, who had long concentrated on defense, now began to exert pressure themselves, drove the Greeks back, tested their limits. It was a turning point, not final, but noticeable. The Greeks, who had given the impression of superiority for so long, began to falter. Unrest grew in the camp. Discussions became louder, doubts stronger. Some openly wondered whether the war could still be won at all without Achilles. Others tried to bring him back, to convince him, to overcome his anger and to fight again. But Achilles remained adamant. His pride did not allow for any compromise, no rowing back, no relenting. For him, the conflict with Agamemnon had become a personal war that had nothing to do with Troy. Meanwhile, the situation on the battlefield continued to escalate. The Trojans pushed forward, gained ground, and for the first time since the beginning of the war, it seemed possible that they could actually drive the Greeks back into the sea. The ships that had once symbolized hope and strength now became a potential retreat. The idea that the campaign could fail was no longer unthinkable. In the midst of this development, Achilles continued to stand on the sidelines. He observed, heard about the fighting, the losses, the successes of the Trojans, and yet he stuck to his decision. His anger was stronger than any duty, stronger than any expectation. But anger has a quality that makes it dangerous. It isolates. It separates the one who feels it from everything else, blinds him to the bigger picture. And that's exactly what began to show. While Achilles withdrew, the war continued without him, and the consequences became more and more apparent. The Greeks lost men, lost ground, lost security. Every day without Achilles made the difference greater, made the gap more visible. And yet it was not only the absence of a warrior that influenced the course of events, but what it symbolized. It showed that even within a large alliance, cracks could arise, that unity could not be taken for granted. This realization was as important to the Trojans as any victory on the battlefield. They saw that their opponents were not infallible, that they had weaknesses that could be exploited. And so the war became not only harder, but also more complex. It was no longer just about who was stronger, but also about who stuck together. The gods watched all this with interest. For them, Achilles' wrath was not just a personal drama, but another move in the big game. Some supported him, reinforced his pride, while others tried to restore the balance. But as is so often the case, they did not intervene directly, but let events take their course. Because sometimes it was more interesting to see how things developed without intervention. And so Achilles remained where he was, a warrior of unimaginable strength, who had taken himself out of war, and whose absence had more impact than his presence could ever have. But deep below the surface, something began to change. Anger, as strong as it may be, rarely lasts. It can burn for a long time, can steer decisions and determine paths, but at some point it reaches a point where it changes into something else, something even more dangerous. And exactly this point had not yet been reached, but it was getting closer, with every day, with every battle, with every loss. The war continued, but now it was no longer the same. It had taken on a new dimension, one that was determined not only by external forces, but by internal conflicts, by decisions that went far beyond the battlefield. And somewhere in this development, the next turning point was already hidden, ready to change everything again. Chapter 8: The Fall of Hector. The war had dragged on for years, had shaped and broken men, had awakened hopes and destroyed them again, and yet there were always moments when everything came to a head, when events intensified, as if fate itself were intervening to make the next step inevitable. One of these moments began not with a major attack or a new strategy, but with a decision born out of desperation. While Achilles remained in anger and refused to fight, the situation of the Greeks deteriorated rapidly, and among those closest to him, there was growing concern that his retreat could decide not only the outcome of individual battles, but the entire war. One of them, his closest confidant, could no longer stand by and watch as the Greeks were pushed back, their ranks crumbled, and their morale sank, so he made a momentous decision. He asked Achilles to be allowed to go into battle in his place, equipped with his armor as a sign, as a symbol, as a hope for the other warriors. Achilles hesitated, but in the end he gave in, not out of conviction, but out of a remnant of responsibility, out of a desire to exert influence, at least indirectly. It was a compromise that was more dangerous than it appeared at that moment, because it brought someone to the center of the war who did not have the same strength, but attracted the same attention. When this warrior appeared on the battlefield in Achilles' armor, the dynamic changed instantly. The Greeks took new courage, believing that their greatest hero had returned, and threw themselves into battle with renewed energy. The Trojans, on the other hand, reacted with caution, with respect, with a memory of what Achilles had already done to them. But among them was one who looked more closely, who looked not only at the outside, but at the behavior, the movements, the small differences that allow an experienced fighter to recognize whether he is really facing his opponent or just an image. Hector was that man, and he realized that something was wrong. For him, this was not a moment of uncertainty, but an opportunity. He confronted the supposed Achilles, not out of recklessness, but out of calculation, out of the knowledge that such a fight could be decisive. What followed was not a long duel, not an even fight, but a confrontation that quickly showed that the armor alone was not enough to replace the man who usually wore it. Hector defeated his opponent, and by the time he realized who he was actually looking at, it was already too late. The death of this man was more than just another loss on the battlefield. It was a signal, an event that had an impact far beyond the moment. When the news reached Achilles, everything changed. The anger that had previously kept him out of battle took on a new form. It was no longer just about pride or honor, but about loss, about pain, about something deeper that could not simply be ignored. This loss broke through the wall he had built around himself, and suddenly the war was real again for him, not as an abstract conflict, but as a personal matter. Achilles returned, but he did not return as the same man who had left. Something in him had changed. His anger had not disappeared, it had become more intense, more focused, more dangerous. He was no longer just looking for fame, but for retribution. And his goal was clear. Hector. The change was also felt in Troy. News of the slain warrior spread quickly, and at first it was hailed as a success. But Hector himself knew that this moment was not only a victory, but also the beginning of something greater. He knew Achilles, knew his reputation, his abilities, and he knew that this death would not go unanswered. Nevertheless, he did not back down. For him, there was no alternative. He was the defender of Troy, and no matter what happened, he would face him. The meeting between Achilles and Hector had become inevitable, a point to which everything was leading, a moment in which two paths that had previously run parallel had to cross. When they finally faced each other, the battlefield was quieter than usual, as if even the other fighters sensed that something crucial was happening. It was more than just a duel, it was a clash of symbols, of meanings, of everything that this war had become. Achilles, driven by anger and loss, and Hector, carried by duty and responsibility. For a brief moment, they faced each other without moving, as if they understood the significance of this moment. But that moment passed, and the fight began. Hector fought with everything he had, with experience, with courage, with a knowledge that he was fighting not only for himself, but for his city, for his family, for everything that lay behind him. Achilles, on the other hand, fought with an intensity that could hardly be tamed, as if he had put everything he felt into this one moment. The fight was fast, harder than many before, and yet it soon became apparent that Achilles was gaining the upper hand. His speed, his strength, his determination, all this left Hector little room to change the course. When Hector fell, it was as if a part of Troy fell with him. His death was not just the loss of a warrior, but the loss of a symbol, a leader, a man who had been the embodiment of hope for many. Achilles' reaction showed how deep his anger went. He was not satisfied with victory, but let his anger continue to have an effect, made it visible to all who could see it. It was a moment that said as much about him as it did about the war itself, a moment that showed how much the conflict had changed people. In Troy, the news was received with horror. Hector's death hit the city to the core. Families mourned, warriors lost their leader, and even those who didn't know him personally felt the void he left behind. Priam lost his son, the city lost its protector, and the prophecy that had remained in the background for so long moved a little closer to reality. The walls were still standing, the city had not yet fallen, but something had changed irrevocably. The war was no longer the same, and the hope that had carried Troy for so long began to crumble. Achilles had gotten what he wanted, but even in his victory there was no rest, no closure, only the certainty that the war would continue, that this moment was decisive, but not the end. And so the battlefield was left behind, marked by what had happened, and both sides knew that they had reached a point of no return. Chapter 9. Hope is fading. After the fall of Hector, something fundamental changed in Troy, something that did not immediately show up in visible signs, but slowly, insidiously, like a crack that runs through solid rock and is only noticed when it is already too large to miss. The walls were still standing, high and mighty as before, the gates were locked, the guards were attentive, and yet the city had lost some of its strength. Not of stone, not of arms, but of confidence. Hector had been more than a warrior, more than a prince. It had been the balance, the calm force that stood between fear and courage and made people believe in the outcome. With his death, this certainty disappeared, and in its place came something uncertain, something fragile that was not so easy to hold on to. People continued to go about their business. Traders opened their stalls, craftsmen worked, families went about their daily lives, but there was something new in their eyes, something that had not been there before, a quiet question that no one said out loud, but that everyone felt. How much longer? This question accompanied her through every day, through every night, through every moment when the sounds of war penetrated the city from outside. For the war had not disappeared, it had only changed, had taken on a new form in which hope and despair were closer together than ever before. The warriors continued to stand on the walls, keeping watch, watching the movements of the Greeks, but something had also shifted among them. They were still fighting, they were still defending, but the belief that they were invincible was broken. Every attack they fended off was a success, but none felt final. Every day they survived was a gain, but none brought them closer to the end. It was as if they had stopped working towards victory and instead began to just survive. In the palace, the change was even more noticeable. King Priam moved more slowly than before, his decisions deliberate, his words cautious, as if he weighed each one before he said it. The loss of his son had marked him, not only as a father, but also as a ruler. He knew that the city needed him, that it needed stability, but at the same time he knew that this stability had become fragile. His thoughts kept returning to the prophecy that had remained in the background for so long and now stood before him with new clarity. It was as if fate had taken another step, as if it had set another sign that could not be ignored. Paris was also moving through this new reality, but its role was different. For many, he continued to be the catalyst for all that had happened, and even though no one said it openly, the truth lay between them like an invisible wall. Paris fought, he showed courage, he tried to fill his place, but he was not Hector, and everyone knew that. He could not close the gap, could not replace what had been lost. And perhaps he felt it most strongly himself. On the other side of the walls, the Greeks had also noticed the change. Hector's death had been a victory, a significant one, a symbolic one, and yet it did not bring the breakthrough he had hoped for. Troy did not fall, the walls remained standing, and the war continued. For many, this was a moment of disillusionment. They had believed that the fall of the greatest defender would be the end of it, that the city would now be weaker, more vulnerable, easier to capture. But instead, it turned out that Troy was more than a single man, that the city itself possessed a strength that could not be easily broken. This realization led to a new form of frustration. The Greeks had won a decisive victory, and yet they still stood before the same walls, still without a clear prospect of an end. Among them, too, hope began to wave. The war, which had once seemed just and necessary, was increasingly questioned. Men who had fought for years wondered if they would ever return home, if this conflict would ever end, or if it would simply continue until there was nothing left. The leaders tried to maintain control, maintain order, boost morale, but they were not free of doubts either. Even Agamemnon sensed that his authority was no longer as unchallenged as it had been at the beginning. The long war had left cracks, not only in the ranks of the soldiers, but also in the structures of the alliance. And somewhere in between all this stood Achilles, whose return had changed the war, but not ended it. His anger had been discharged, his revenge had been accomplished, and yet something remained, a void that even victory could not fill. The war was bigger than his personal history, bigger than his anger, and that was now clearer than ever. The fighting continued, but it felt different. Less determined, less purposeful, as if both sides were no longer working towards victory, but simply kept going because they saw no other way. It was a state of affairs that was dangerous because it left room for change, for new ideas, for decisions that might never have been made under other circumstances. In Troy, some began to think about alternatives, about ways to end the war without losing the city. But such thoughts were difficult, risky, because they meant acknowledging the inevitable, meant no longer believing in complete victory. At the same time, there were those who held on to exactly that, who were convinced that Troy could hold out, that the walls were strong enough that the enemy would eventually give up. These two attitudes coexisted without fully connecting, and this was precisely where there was another tension that weakened the city from within. The nights became heavier. When the sounds of the day fell silent and darkness fell over the city, the thoughts became louder. The people lay awake, heard the distant sound of the sea, the crackling of the fires, the occasional call of the guards, and thought about what was, about what could come, about what might never be again. Hope is a strange feeling. It can last a long time, even in the most difficult circumstances, but once it begins to fade, it is hard to regain it. This is exactly what happened in Troy. Not suddenly, not for everyone at the same time, but bit by bit, from person to person, from thought to thought. And although the city was still standing, although the war had not yet been decided, a truth began to emerge that was increasingly difficult to ignore. The outcome was no longer open as it had once been. The possibilities became fewer, the paths narrower, and somewhere beyond walls and battlefields, something was being prepared that would end all of this, not by strength alone, but by something else, something unexpected. But it wasn't that far yet. They still fought, they still hoped, they were still alive. But hope was no longer what it had once been. She had become quieter, more cautious, and perhaps closer to the end than anyone was willing to admit. Chapter 10: The Cunning of Odysseus. The war had reached a point where neither strength nor endurance alone were enough to decide it. The years had shown that Troy could not be broken simply by force, and that even the greatest heroes were not able to bring down the walls. The Greeks were still standing in front of the city, but their attacks had not fundamentally changed anything, and the Trojans were still holding out, albeit with growing exhaustion. It was a state of affairs that could not last forever, and that was precisely the realization that initiated the next step. If the war could not be decided by force, then it had to be ended in another way. In the midst of the Greek leaders, it was above all one man who began to think these thoughts further, to shape them, to give them a direction. Odysseus was not a warrior like Achilles, not one who dominated the battlefield by mere presence. His strength lay not in direct combat, but in thinking, observing, understanding connections that remained hidden from others. While many continued to bet on the next attack, Odysseus began to look at the war as a whole, not as a succession of battles, but as a problem that needed to be solved. And in this problem lay a crucial question: what was Troy's greatest strength? The answer was obvious and yet difficult to overcome: the walls. They were not only physically strong, but also a symbol, a protective shield that had saved the city from falling for years. Every attempt to break through it had failed. Every direct confrontation had shown that an attack from outside alone would not be enough. So the next question was, if you couldn't get through the walls from the outside, how could you get inside? This question became the starting point of an idea that was initially so unusual that it was met with skepticism even among the Greeks. Odysseus began to think about deception, about strategies based not on strength but on perception. He knew that the Trojans were tired, that their hope wavered, that they longed for an end, even if they did not openly admit it. And it was precisely in this state that there was a possibility. A city that has been besieged for a long time begins to think differently. It becomes more cautious, but also more susceptible to signs, to clues, to things that seem like solutions. Odysseus realized that the key was not to defeat the Trojans, but to get them to make a decision that weakened themselves. It was a thought that required courage, not in the classical sense, but in a willingness to try something that was unconventional, that carried risks, that was not immediately comprehensible. When he finally put forward his idea, he initially met with doubts. Some saw it as an ingenious possibility, others thought it was too unsafe, too dependent on factors that could not be controlled. Because deception is always a game with uncertainty. It only works if the opponent accepts it, if he sees what you want to show him, and not what is actually behind it. But this was precisely their strength. While a direct attack was predictable, a ruse could surprise the opponent, subvert his expectations, and lead him to behave in a way he would never have chosen under normal circumstances. Odysseus argued not only with logic, but also with experience. The war had shown that new approaches were necessary, that the previous approach did not lead to the goal. And so an agreement slowly began to form, at first cautiously, then more decisively. The idea took shape. It was simple at its core and yet complex in its implementation. An object was to be created, something large enough to attract attention and at the same time meaningful enough to appear credible. It had to be something that the Trojans didn't immediately recognize as a threat, but as a sign, as a message, maybe even as a gift. At the same time, it had to serve a hidden purpose, had to offer space for those who would take the decisive step. The choice fell on a symbol that was both impressive and ambiguous: a big, wooden horse. Its shape was not chosen at random. It had meaning, it could be interpreted, it could be seen as an offering, as a sign of surrender, as something that was not immediately destroyed. But behind this outward appearance was the real plan. Inside the horse there was to be room for selected warriors, men who were willing to embark on a risky undertaking, who had to trust that the plan would work, that they would play the decisive role in the end of the war. There was no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. Everyone who participated in it had to understand that there was no turning back, that success depended on their determination. Preparations began. Wood was collected, workers instructed to build the horse, larger than anything seen before. It was a project that attracted attention, that raised questions, but at the same time it was part of a larger plan that few were fully aware of. While the horse was created, the next step was also prepared. The Greeks had to give the impression that they had given up the war, that they were retreating, that all the years of fighting had led to no result. It was a risky part of the plan, because it required discipline, coordination, and, above all, credibility. The Trojans were not allowed to raise suspicions, not to have the feeling that something was wrong. And so the Greeks began to dismantle their camp, prepare their ships, cover their tracks. It was a staging, carefully planned, designed to achieve a certain effect. The men who were not part of the horse were to retreat, go out of sight, leave the impression of a final withdrawal. The horse, on the other hand, remained behind, as the only sign of their presence, as a riddle waiting to be interpreted. For Odysseus, this was the decisive moment. His idea had now become a reality, but its success no longer depended solely on him. It was in the hands of the Trojans, in their decisions, in their perception. Would they see the horse for what it pretended to be, or would they look behind it? This question could not be answered, could not be controlled. It was part of the risk, part of the uncertainty that accompanies every ruse. But this was precisely where the possibility of a breakthrough lay. While the final preparations were being made, there was a mixture of tension and hope in the camp. The men knew that they were at a turning point, that what happened now could end the war, or prolong it even further. It was a moment when everything was focused on a single idea, on a plan that seemed so simple and yet demanded so much from those involved. And as the sun slowly set and the light drifted across the battlefield, it was clear that the next step would not be decided by strength, but by something else. Through trust, through deception, through the willingness to question the obvious, or not. The war had changed, and with it the way it would be decided. What could not be achieved by force for years was now to be made possible by a single well-placed idea. And this idea had only just begun to unfold. Chapter 11. The Structure of the Horse. The idea was born, but there was a long way between a thought and its implementation, a path full of details, decisions, and risks that could make or break it. What had at first seemed like a brilliant inspiration now had to be translated into reality, had to take shape, had to be so convincing that even suspicious eyes had no doubt. Under the leadership of Odysseus, a process began that was as careful as it was extraordinary. It wasn't just about building a big wooden horse, it was about creating a symbol, an object that told a story without needing words, a sign that had just the right effect. Every step had to be considered, every decision thought through, because a single discrepancy could be enough to jeopardize the entire plan. The Greeks, who had relied on open confrontation for so long, now had to do something that was less familiar to them. They had to deceive, they had to create an illusion that was more credible than the truth. The wood was brought in from the surrounding areas, strong, massive trunks that promised stability and could be worked at the same time. The workers who were tasked with building it were experienced, skilled with tools and materials, but they also had to understand that this was no ordinary structure. It was not about function in the classical sense, not about protection or attack, but about effect. The horse had to be big enough to make an impression, to inspire respect, maybe even awe. At the same time, it couldn't seem like a threat. It had to be coherent in itself, had to convey a story that the Trojans could understand without it being explained to them. As the construction grew, a shape gradually emerged that was very different from anything that had been seen on the battlefield before. It was not an instrument of war, not a tool of siege, but something that lay between art and purpose, something that raised questions without providing immediate answers. But the outward appearance was only part of the plan. A space has been created inside the horse, hidden, shielded, large enough to accommodate a select group of warriors. These men had been carefully chosen, not only for their skills, but also for their discipline, their willingness to embark on an undertaking that required courage in a different form than open combat. They had to be able to be quiet, patient, had to persevere, without knowing exactly when the decisive moment would come. It was a different kind of strength that was needed here, one that was less visible but no less decisive. As the horse took shape, the atmosphere in the Greek camp also began to change. The men, who were not directly involved in the construction, observed the events with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some understood the plan, believed in its effect, saw it as the only way to finally end the long war. Others doubted, wondered whether such a deception could really be enough, whether the Trojans would not be suspicious, whether they would not recognize that something was wrong. These doubts were not unfounded, because the entire plan was based on one assumption, that the Trojans were willing to see the horse for what it pretended to be, and not for what it actually was. This assumption could not be verified, could not be secured, it could only be hoped. And this was precisely the risk that Odysseus consciously took. Meanwhile, the second part of the plan was also being prepared, which was just as important as the horse itself. The Greeks had to disappear. Not just leaving the camp, but disappearing in a way that made it seem credible, that it seemed like a final retreat, not a tactical maneuver. The tracks had to be covered, the tents dismantled, the fires extinguished. Nothing could be left behind that gave the impression that they would return soon. The ships were prepared, not for a long voyage, but for a movement that took place out of sight. They should withdraw, hide, wait. Here, too, precision was required, because any carelessness could jeopardize the plan. The Trojans had to believe that the war was over, that the Greeks had given up, that all the years of fighting had led to no result. This idea had to be convincing, had to fit into the image that had developed over time. A long war without a clear decision could well end in a retreat, in a surrender, in an admission that the price had become too high. Odysseus relied on exactly this image. When the horse was finally completed, it towered over the abandoned camp, a silent, impressive object that attracted attention by its size and shape alone. It was not just a building, but a message, a sign waiting to be interpreted. The warriors who were to take their seats inside were preparing. They knew that they had now reached a point of no return. Once in the horse, they were part of the plan, part of a moment that could decide the outcome of the war. Her task was clear, but the timing of her actions was not in her control. They had to wait, they had to trust, they had to hope that everything would go as planned. For Odysseus, this was the moment when his idea had become complete. Everything was prepared, everything was in its place, and yet the result was now beyond his direct control. It was a strange state, a mixture of control and loss of control. He had developed the plan, had implemented it, had set the stages, but now everything depended on the decisions of others. By the Trojans, by their perception, by their trust or mistrust. While the final preparations were being made, a tense calm lay over the camp. It was not a moment of triumph, not a moment of celebration, but a moment of concentration, of expectation. Everyone knew that what followed would be decisive. There was no second chance, no room for corrections. The plan was designed to either work or fail. There was nothing in between. And that's exactly what made him so powerful, but also so dangerous. As the sun approached the horizon and the light slowly faded, the final movements began. The men who were not in the horse withdrew, left the camp, boarded the ships. The fleet began to move, slowly disappearing from view until only the sea remained, calm and seemingly empty. The horse was left behind, alone, motionless, like a relic of a past war. It stood where the camp had once been, waiting. Waited for the looks, for the decisions, for what was to come. For the Greeks, this was a moment of hope, perhaps the last great hope they had. For the Trojans, it was a mystery that would soon confront them. And between these two perspectives was the crucial point at which everything could change. Because sometimes it is not strength that decides how a war ends, but the way you see what lies ahead. And that's exactly what this plan was based on. On perception, on interpretation, on the willingness to believe something that seemed too good to be true. Chapter 12. The Retreat of the Greeks. When the horse finally stood alone before the walls of Troy, the second, equally decisive part of the plan began to take shape, a part that was less visible than the massive structure itself, but no less important. For the horse was only half of the deception. The other half was the disappearance of the Greeks. What had existed for years as an unshakable presence at the gates of the city now suddenly had to disappear, and so completely and convincingly that even suspicious eyes had no doubt. It was not a simple retreat, not an orderly departure, as it would take place after a lost battle, but a staging, a carefully choreographed disappearance that was intended to create the impression of a final end. The Greeks knew that not only did they have to dismantle their tents and board their ships, but that every movement, every trace, every detail was part of the illusion. The warehouse, which had grown over the years, was dismantled piece by piece as if it had never existed. Fireplaces were extinguished, supplies were removed or deliberately left behind to reinforce the impression of haste and abandonment, and even the paths that had run through the camp began to disappear as if they had never been more than a passing sign. It was a strange moment for many of the men who had called this place home for so long. They had fought, suffered, hoped, doubted here, and now they left everything as if it had become meaningless. But behind this apparent indifference lay a deep tension, a knowledge that they were not really leaving, but only disappearing, that they were not turning away from the war, but only withdrawing from view. The ships that had once marked the beginning of the campaign now became tools of deception. They were loaded, prepared, and finally lowered into the water, and when they started moving, it all seemed like a real retreat. Sails stretched in the wind, oars broke through the surface of the sea, and slowly the fleet moved away from the coast. From the walls of Troy, this image had to have a clear effect. The Greeks withdrew, gave up, left the war behind. But in reality it was not a departure, but a circle, not an end, but a break. The ships moved only until they were out of sight, until the distance was great enough to create the impression of a final disappearance, and then they stopped, waited, hidden behind the line of the horizon. It was a state between movement and standstill, between presence and absence, and that was precisely where its effect lay. The men on board knew that they had to return at any time, that they had to be ready as soon as the signal came, but that signal was out of their control. It depended on what happened in Troy, on the decisions that were made there. Meanwhile, the horse remained behind, as the only visible sign of the Greeks, as a silent witness to their supposed retreat. It stood where the camp had once been, and its presence seemed almost uncanny, as if it had a meaning of its own that went beyond its form. For the Greeks who had withdrawn, it was the core of their plan, the point to which it all boiled down. For the Trojans who would soon discover it, it was a mystery, an object that raised questions that could not be answered immediately. As morning broke and the light fell across the plain, the Trojans began to notice the changes. At first, it was the guards on the walls who saw that something was different, that the camp of the Greeks no longer showed the same activity as before, that movements that had been constant for years were missing. The news spread quickly, and soon people were gathering on the walls, looking out, looking for signs, for confirmation of what they thought they saw. And what they saw was amazing. The Greeks were gone. No more smoke rose from their fireplaces, no voices could be heard, no movements could be seen. Instead, there was an unfamiliar silence over the battlefield, a calm that seemed almost unreal after all these years of noise, fighting, the constant presence of the enemy. It was a moment that awakened hope, but also doubts. Because such a withdrawal was not easy to explain. Why should the Greeks suddenly give up, after all these years, after all the sacrifices? Was it possible that they had actually ended the war, that they had realized that Troy could not be defeated? Or was it part of a larger plan, a deception that was not yet fully visible? These questions began to form, quietly at first, then more clearly, as people looked at the situation, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Some saw it as a sign of victory, proof that Troy had held out, that the walls had served their purpose, that the city had been stronger than the enemy. Others were more cautious, paused, looked at the scene with a look that sought more than just the obvious. They wondered if something was missing, if something was wrong, if the absence of the Greeks really meant what it seemed to mean. In the midst of these different reactions, the horse stood still, motionless, and yet the center of attention. It was the only thing that remained, the only element that didn't fit into the picture of a complete retreat. And that is exactly why it became the focus of thoughts, discussions, decisions that now had to be made. For the Trojans, this was a moment of choice. They could accept what they saw, could believe that the war was over, could interpret the horse as a sign of this end. Or they could doubt, they could question, they could try to see more than what was visible at first glance. This decision was not easy, because it was determined not only by logic, but also by emotions, by hope, by the wish that all the suffering had come to an end. The years of war had left their mark, and the prospect of peace was tempting, perhaps too tempting to question immediately. While the Trojans deliberated, discussed, exchanged ideas, the Greeks waited. On their ships, hidden from the eyes of the city, they stopped, watched from a distance as much as possible, and waited for the sign that would show them if their plan was working. It was a time of tension in which every hour, every moment could be decisive. No one knew how the Trojans would react. No one could be sure that the deception would succeed. But it was precisely this uncertainty that was the essence of the plan. It was designed to provoke this decision, to put the Trojans in a situation in which they had to act themselves, in which their perception decided the outcome. And so two realities faced each other, separated by the walls of the city and the distance of the sea, connected by a plan based on deception. The Greeks, who had apparently disappeared, and the Trojans, who believed that they might have survived the war. Between them lay the horse, still motionless, and yet full of meaning. An object that was more than just wood and shape, a symbol of what was to come. Because the withdrawal of the Greeks was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of his last chapter. Chapter 13, Laocoön's Warning. The silence that had fallen over the battlefield was of a strange quality. It was not the calm, peaceful silence of a day without danger, but one that raised questions, that carried restlessness within it, that could not be easily classified. For many in Troy, however, it was a sign of hope, perhaps even relief, but not all were willing to accept it without doubt. As people gathered on the walls, looking out and trying to understand what had happened, their gaze kept falling on the one object that seemed like a foreign body in this new reality, the huge wooden horse. It stood where the camp of the Greeks had once been, and precisely because it was the only thing left behind, it attracted attention. Some saw it as a sign, an offering, perhaps even a symbol of surrender, but others instinctively sensed that something was wrong, that the situation was too simple to be true. Among these doubters was a man whose voice carried weight, not only because of his position, but also because of his clarity, his ability to question things that others readily accepted. Laocoön stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the horse, and in his eyes there was no enthusiasm, no hope, but skepticism that could not be concealed. For him, what stood outside the walls was not a gift, not a sign of peace, but a riddle that could not simply be ignored. He looked at the situation not only from the perspective of a man who had lived through the war, but also from the perspective of a priest, a person who had learned to pay attention to signs, to what was hidden behind the obvious. And everything about this picture seemed wrong to him. The Greeks, who had been so determined for years, should have suddenly given up. You who had made so many sacrifices, should have simply disappeared, without a last attempt, without a clear decision. And then this horse, big, flashy, left behind like a message waiting to be understood. For Laocoön it was too much, too perfect, too staged to be believable. His voice rose, calm at first, then more clearly as he began to voice his doubts. He warned the others, shouted to them that they should be careful, that they should not believe everything they saw. He reminded them that deception was a part of war, that the enemy fought not only with weapons, but also with cunning. His words were heard, at least by some, but they also met with resistance. Because while doubt can play an important role, hope is often stronger, especially after long years of suffering. Many wanted to believe that the war was over, that the Greeks had given up, that the horse was a sign of this end. To them, Laocoön's warning was not only a warning to caution, but also a threat to the hope they were only just beginning to feel again. The discussions intensified, voices were raised, arguments were exchanged, and the horse continued to stand there, still motionless, as if watching all this, as if it were aware of its role. Laocoön did not let up. The danger was too great for him to remain silent, and so he went one step further. He approached the horse, looked at it closely, looked for clues, for signs that could confirm his suspicions. Finally, he resorted to an action that made his conviction clear. He raised his spear and hurled it against the horse's wood. The impact echoed across the plain, a dull sound that silenced the conversations for a moment. It was a sound that said more than many words, a sign that the horse was not just an empty object. For a moment, it seemed as if the truth was coming to the surface, as if this one moment would be enough to break through the deception. But at that very moment, something happened that changed people's perceptions, something that made Laocoön's words appear in a different light. Two huge snakes approached from the sea, their bodies shiny, their movements swift and purposeful. They were moving toward the coast, directly toward Laocoön and his sons, and before anyone could intervene, they were already with them. What followed was a moment of horror that was deeply imprinted on everyone's memory. The snakes attacked, entwined the bodies, tightened tightly, and despite all attempts to free themselves, despite all the shouts, all the movements, there was no escape. The scene was so sudden, so unexpected, that it completely attracted attention, that everything else took a back seat for a moment. When it was over, only silence remained, a silence heavier than the one before, because it had been broken by something that was not easy to explain. For the people of Troy, this was not a random event, not a mere attack by animals, but a sign, an intervention of the gods that could not be ignored. And the interpretation was obvious. Laocoön had opposed something he should not have questioned. He had attacked the horse, sowed doubts, and now he had been punished for it. This view spread quickly, gained weight, suppressed the doubts that had previously been expressed. What had previously appeared as a warning was now seen as a mistake, as presumption, as something that the gods had not accepted. And so the perception shifted. The horse was no longer seen as a potential danger, but as something that had to be respected, perhaps even as something sacred. Laocoön's warning lost its meaning, was overshadowed by what had happened, and with every moment that passed, it became more difficult to take his words seriously. People began to choose differently, no longer out of doubt, but out of trust, out of a feeling that what lay ahead was part of a larger plan that they didn't need to fully understand. But it was precisely in this change that the tragedy of the situation lay. Because the warning had not been wrong, it had just come at the wrong time, overshadowed by an event that had a stronger effect than any argument. Laocoön had seen what others did not want to see, had spoken what many thought but did not want to say, and yet in the end his voice was not strong enough to influence the decision. So the horse stopped, motionless, untouched, and the people of Troy began to approach it, to look at it, to accept it. The discussions ebbed away, the doubts became quieter, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, uncertainty turned into a decision. A decision that was not only based on logic, but on emotions, on signs, on what one wanted to believe. And that was exactly where the power of deception lay. It didn't force anyone, it didn't convince through violence, but through perception, through the way people interpreted reality. The horse was not just an object, it was a mirror of what was going on in the minds of the Trojans. And as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, it was clear that the warning had faded, that the decision had been made, even if it had not yet been fully implemented. The war had reached a point where it was no longer swords or walls that decided the outcome, but thoughts, beliefs, and a willingness to believe something that felt right. And that is exactly what made this moment so decisive, so dangerous, so irreversible. Chapter 14: The Night of Betrayal. As the sun sank behind the walls of Troy and darkness slowly settled over the city, everything seemed calmer than the nights before, almost as if the world itself had withdrawn for a moment to catch its breath. The sounds of war, which had determined everyday life for so long, were missing. No clash of weapons, no shouts from the battlefield, no distant roar of movement in the enemy camp. Instead, an unfamiliar silence hung over everything, a silence that many interpreted as peace, as the beginning of a new phase after years of struggle. The gates of the city had been opened, at first cautiously, then more resolutely, and the huge wooden horse had been dragged into the interior of Troy, accompanied by voices, by discussions, by a mixture of curiosity and cautious confidence. It now stood in the heart of the city, surrounded by houses, by streets, by people who looked at it as if it were a sign, a conclusion, a symbol that the war was finally over. But as people slowly let themselves fall into this idea, as they began to let go of the tension of the previous years, something happened that none of them could see, something that remained hidden inside the horse. There in the darkness, huddled tightly together, the selected warriors, led by Odysseus, waited, silent, motionless, tense. Every breath was controlled, every movement suppressed, because they knew that a single mistake could ruin everything. They had prepared for this moment, had decided to be part of this plan, and now there was no turning back. The city around them lived, moved, perhaps even celebrated cautiously, but they themselves were trapped in a state of waiting, of perseverance, of silent observation, without really being able to see. Time passed differently for her, slower, heavier, every minute dragged on as if she refused to pass. They could only hear the voices outside, the occasional laughter, the murmur of conversations, the clinking of footsteps on stone. These sounds were both calming and unsettling, because they meant that the plan had worked so far, that the Trojans had accepted the horse, that they had no idea. But at the same time, they made it clear how close they were to their goal, how thin the line between success and discovery was. As the night progressed, the city changed. The voices became quieter, the movements fewer, and gradually silence returned. People retreated to their homes, the streets emptied, and the darkness thickened, broken only by a few lights flickering in windows or thrown by torches. For the warriors inside the horse, this was the signal they had been waiting for, the moment when the city was at its most vulnerable, when vigilance eased and fatigue took over. But it was not yet time to act. They still had to wait. They had to be sure that everything was quiet enough, that there was no one left on the streets, that no unforeseen movements would disturb their action. These last moments were the hardest, because they were filled with expectation, with tension, with the certainty that the decisive moment was imminent. Finally, when the night had reached its lowest point and the city lay in apparent calm, the signal came. Quietly, carefully, almost inaudibly, something began to move inside the horse. The men straightened up, prepared themselves. Everyone knew what to do. Everyone knew their role. The opening was made, the wood gave way, and one by one they glided out into the darkness, carefully, deliberately, careful not to make a sound. The soil of Troy lay beneath their feet, but it was not a moment of triumph, not a moment of jubilation, but one of concentration, of precision. They were in the heart of the city, surrounded by walls they hadn't been able to overcome for years, and now everything depended on how they behaved in those first minutes. Odysseus took the lead, moving through the shadows, leading the men to their destination. The goals. It was the key to the whole plan, the point at which everything would be decided. While part of the group focused on reaching and opening the gates, others moved around the city, securing paths, removing possible obstacles, all with an efficiency that had come from years of experience. The guards who were still standing on the walls or at the gates were unprepared, surprised by an attack that did not come from outside, but from within the city itself. It was a moment of confusion, of uncertainty, and it was precisely this confusion that was exploited. The gates were opened. Slowly at first, then on until the way was clear. Outside, beyond the walls, the Greek army was waiting. The ships that had retreated had long since been on the move again, had reached the coast again, and now, under cover of night, the warriors were approaching the city, ready to complete what they had been trying to do for so long. When the gates opened, there was no hesitation. The Greeks streamed in, quickly, resolutely, and suddenly the silence of the night was broken. Sounds returned, but this time not as a distant echo of a war, but as an immediate reality inside Troy. Screams, footsteps, the clash of weapons, all of this spread, faster than people could react. The Trojans, who had believed that the war was over, were surprised in their sleep, torn from their calm, without time to organize themselves, to defend themselves. It was not an orderly battle, not a clash of armies, but an attack from within, a moment in which the city itself had become a trap. Houses were opened, Streets were filled, and chaos, confusion, fear arose everywhere. The walls that had protected for so long had now become meaningless, for the enemy was already inside. For the Greeks, this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when all the years of struggle reached their peak. For the Trojans, it was the moment when the deception was fully revealed, when it became clear that what they had seen as a gift was actually their downfall. And in the midst of this chaos, the men who had come out of the horse moved as if they were in control of what was happening, as if they were the trigger of an event that could no longer be stopped. The night that had begun with hope turned into a night of betrayal, a night in which everything was decided, not by strength alone, but by the consequence of a single momentous decision. Chapter 15: The Fall of Troy. The night, which had begun with silence, turned into an inferno that inexorably ate its way through the streets of Troy. What had just seemed like a safe haven became a place of confusion, horror, and destruction within a few moments. The gates were open, the walls that had protected so long had lost their meaning, and the Greek warriors streamed through the streets as if they had never known a frontier. It was no longer an orderly attack, a struggle between two clearly defined sides, but a breakdown of order itself. Chaos broke out everywhere, and in this chaos the city lost its structure, its security, its identity. People were roused from their sleep, did not immediately understand what was happening, heard screams, saw flames, felt the movement of something that could no longer be stopped. Some tried to flee, others took up arms, still others searched for their families, shouted names into the darkness in the hope of hearing answers. But the night swallowed up these voices, mingled them with the noise of the attack, made them drown in a sound that overshadowed everything. For the Greeks, this was the moment they had been working towards for so long, the moment when the war was decided. But even for them, the situation was different than they might have expected. It was not a triumphant victory in the open field, not a clear proof of their strength, but an attack that came from within, that had been made possible by deception and now led to a reality that was difficult to control. The warriors moved through the city, following orders, looking for targets, but all around them there was more happening than they could control. Houses were broken into, streets filled up, and the line between struggle and destruction became increasingly blurred. In the midst of this, Priam tried to maintain control, but it was a futile endeavor. The king, who had ruled over Troy for so long, now saw his city fall apart piece by piece. The walls he had relied on could no longer do anything. The defense that had worked for so long had become meaningless. He moved through the palace, looking for a way to put the situation in order, but there was no order anymore. All that remained was an attempt to understand how it could have come to this, how a city that had held out for so long could be brought to the brink of ruin in a single night. For many of the Trojans, it was precisely this incomprehensibility that made the moment so difficult. They had survived the war, repelled the attacks, believed they had been through the worst part, and now it was all happening on a night when they had felt safe. This discrepancy between expectation and reality made the collapse all the more brutal. It was not only the loss of security, but also the loss of trust, in their own decisions, in their perception, in what they had believed. The horse that had stood in the center of the city now became a symbol of what had happened. It was no longer just an object, but a sign of the deception, of the decision that had changed everything. The realization came too late, but it was inevitable. The Greeks had not won by strength, but by what the Trojans themselves had allowed. As the fire spread and the flames began to engulf the buildings, the destruction became visible, tangible, irreversible. The light of the fire lit up the night, cast shadows on the walls, made the city appear in a new, frightening picture. The sounds became louder, more intense, as if the city itself were screaming, as if it were defending itself against its own end. But there was no resistance strong enough to stop what was happening. The Greeks had taken control, and with each passing moment it became clearer that this was not just a victory, but a final conclusion. Odysseus moved through the city, saw the consequences of his plan, saw how the idea he had developed had now become reality. For him, this was proof that strategy and deception could achieve what brute force had not been able to do. But even at that moment, it was clear that this victory had a price that went beyond immediate success. The war that had lasted so long did not end in a simple triumph, but in an image of destruction that would be deeply engraved in memory. There was little time for the Trojans to think about these thoughts. They were in the middle of the action, had to react, had to make decisions that often took only seconds and yet decided on life and death. Some tried to defend the city, rallied and fought, even though they knew that the situation was hopeless. Others were looking for a way out, a way to escape the chaos, to leave the city before it was too late. But even these paths were uncertain, unclear, and not everyone had the chance to use them. The night progressed, and with it the setting became more complete. What was once one of the greatest cities began to transform into something else, a place that lost its identity, that consisted only of fragments, of memories, of what had once been. The walls were still standing, but they no longer protected anything. The streets still existed, but they no longer led to an orderly life. Everything that had made up Troy was dissolved that night. When the first signs of the morning appeared on the horizon, it was clear that the war had come to an end. But this end was not silent, not peaceful, not clear. It was the result of years of struggle, of decisions, of mistakes, of moments that had combined to an inevitable outcome. Troy had fallen, not in a single battle, but in an interplay of strength, endurance, and ultimately deception. For the Greeks, this was the end of a long campaign. For the Trojans, the end of their city, their security, their world. And above all this lay a realization that could not simply be ignored. The war had been decided not only by what happened on the battlefield, but by what people believed, by the decisions they made, by the way they interpreted reality. The Trojan horse had not only been a tool, but a symbol of this truth. When the sun finally rose and the light fell over the ruins, the extent of what had happened became apparent. Troy was no longer the city it had once been. And the war that had lasted so long was over, not with a clear victory, but with a story that would be told for a long time to come.